All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because, well, you want to get to the good stuff, right? Skip the fluff. Get to
Yeah.
the core insights. That's what we're all about. And that is exactly what we are diving into today. We're talking about writing, specifically how to get better at it. We all want to write better.
And we got some pretty cool research actually to help us unpack that. We're going to zoom out and look at a whole bunch of studies at once. This is what's called a meta-analysis, and it comes from Turkey, published just a couple of years ago. And it really gives us this big picture view of what's been discovered about improving writing skills.
Okay, meta-analysis.
Mhm.
So just for anyone listening who maybe hasn't encountered that term before, what we're talking about here is a study of studies instead of just one experiment. These researchers have gathered up the results from a whole lot of them to try to find the common threads and the strongest evidence.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about 77 different experimental studies in this case. And the authors are Graham Tufsanley and Calderbream. And these weren't just small-scale studies either. These all involve looking at specific ways to help students write better in Turkish schools. And across all of those studies, we were talking about nearly 5,000 students. 4,891 to be exact, and that spans from elementary school all the way through college.
Wow. Okay, so that gives you a real sense of the scale of this. And all of this research conducted in the years leading up to 2021 when this meta-analysis was published really zoomed in on one key thing.
Hmm.
How good was the students' writing after they tried these different methods?
Exactly right. That was the outcome that all of these studies were measuring. So, as we go through this, think of it like this: your mission is to really distill the wisdom. What are the big takeaways? What did these 77 studies combined tell us about what seems to really move the needle on writing quality in Turkey? And even more interesting for you, what might that tell us about how to improve writing for anybody, anywhere?
I like it, a mission. Okay, so let's get into it. I guess the first question is, across all these different experiments, all these different approaches, was there a clear signal that writing interventions actually made a difference? Did they work?
Yes, big time. I mean, the average weighted effect size across all 77 studies was 1.39.
Okay, effect size, hold on. Let's unpack that. What does that actually mean, 1.39? Help us make sense of that number.
Sure. So an effect size is basically a way of measuring how much of a difference some kind of intervention makes. So in this case, an educational intervention. And in the world of educational research, 1.39, that's not small. That is a very large effect size. So it means that on average, across these studies, these writing interventions were having a huge positive impact on student writing.
Wow. Okay, so big picture, even before we get into specifics, the message here is that when educators in Turkey were intentional about trying to help students write better, it worked. Good news.
Oh,
But I'm curious, were there particular kinds of writing help that seemed to be especially effective?
yes, definitely. So the researchers looked at a whole bunch of different rating treatments, but there were 5 in particular that showed up in at least 4 or more of the studies that they analyzed. So that gives us a little bit more confidence that we're seeing some consistent results.
Got it. More data, more confidence.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's walk through these top contenders.
Yeah.
What was the first one that stood out?
Okay. The first one is called peer assistance. And across the studies that looked at this, it had an average weighted effect size of 0.92.
Okay, so peer assistance.
Yeah.
Just so everyone's on the same page, what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, it could involve a few different things, but essentially it's about students working together on their writing in some way. So that could look like reading each other's drafts and giving feedback or suggestions, offering ideas, just having that extra set of eyes on your work.
Right, so it's like that saying two heads are better than one. Sometimes you're just so deep in your own writing that you can't see the forest for the trees. You need someone else's perspective.
Exactly. And what's interesting here is that even though this had the lowest effect size of the 5 we're going to talk about, a
Mhm.
0.92 is still a really solid positive effect. It suggests that peer feedback can be a pretty valuable tool.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so peer assistance was number one. What was the next really effective treatment they found?
So the next one is pre-writing activities. And this one was actually the strongest out of all of them. It had an average weighted effect size of 1.55.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, 1.55. So compared to that 0.92 we were just talking about for peer assistance, that sounds like a pretty big difference. So what exactly does pre-writing activities mean?
Yeah. So think about everything that happens before you actually sit down and start writing your first draft. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So it could include brainstorming ideas, maybe making an outline, planning your arguments, doing some initial research, just getting your thoughts organized before you actually start putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard.
That's interesting. Because I think often, when we have to write something, the temptation is just to dive right in. But it sounds like what this research is suggesting is that taking the time to actually prepare and organize your thoughts can have a huge impact on how well you write.
Yes. And, for you, the listener who's interested in learning quickly and effectively, this is a great example of how sometimes slowing down and laying that foundation can really make a difference. It's like you're building a house. You don't just start putting up the walls without a solid foundation. And the
Yeah.
same can be true for writing.
Absolutely. So that's a big takeaway. Pre-writing activities. Really powerful. Okay, what was number 3 on the list of effective treatments?
Number 3 is the process approach to writing. And this one had an average weighted effect size of 1.30.
Okay, the process approach. I feel like I've heard that term before. Can you remind me what that actually refers to?
Sure. So instead of thinking about writing as this one big monolithic task, the process approach breaks it down into a series of stages. And typically those stages are planning, drafting, revising, and then editing. And the idea is that you move through these stages, maybe going back and forth a bit, rather than trying to get everything perfect on the first try.
This is a more structured way of tackling the task of writing.
Yeah.
You're not just staring at a blank page, hoping for inspiration to strike. It's more like you have a roadmap or a step-by-step guide.
Exactly. And with that effect size of 1.30, it's clear that this framework, this process approach can really make a difference.
I like that. Less intimidating, more manageable. Okay, so we've got peer assistance, we've got pre-writing activities, we've got the process approach to writing. What are the last couple of key treatments?
Right. Yeah, so the fourth one is called strategy instruction, and that had an average weighted effect size of 1.28. And strategy instruction, it basically involves explicitly teaching students specific writing techniques and skills. So that could include things like different ways to start an introduction, how to write really strong topic sentences, various methods for organizing paragraphs. So it's about giving students a concrete set of tools they can use in their writing.
So it's not just about understanding the overall process of writing,
Yeah.
but actually giving you the nuts and bolts, the how-to knowledge for different parts of writing.
Yeah, exactly. It's equipping you, the learner, with the skills and the know-how to actually improve your writing.
I like it. Okay, so we've got peer assistance, pre-writing process, approach, strategy, instruction. Now, as you're looking at these top 4, are there any common themes or underlying ideas that kind of tie them together for you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stands out is that the most powerful interventions, those top 3, pre-writing process approach and strategy instruction, they all share this idea of a very active and structured approach to writing. So it's not just about letting the words flow out of you. It's about deliberate planning, breaking down the task into smaller chunks, learning specific techniques, really being intentional and strategic with your writing.
And I guess that makes sense because in so many areas of life, whether it's learning a new skill or achieving a goal, having a plan and having specific strategies is essential.
Absolutely.
Now, what about peer assistance? I know it had a slightly lower effect size, but it's still significant. And I'm curious how you see that fitting into the big picture.
Yeah, I think that even though it wasn't the single most powerful technique on its own, it really underscores the value of collaboration in writing, getting feedback from others, having different perspectives on your work. Even if it's not the thing that moves the needle the most, it's still an incredibly important part of the process.
Right. And it seems like some of these things could work really well together too, right? Like
Yeah.
you could easily teach specific writing strategies within the context of that process approach.
Absolutely. And I think, in practice, the most effective writing instruction might very well involve weaving together these different elements. So you might explicitly teach pre-writing strategies as part of the planning stage of the writing process, and then incorporate peer feedback during the revision stage, for example.
Okay. I'm getting a really clear picture here. So this meta-analysis is giving us some pretty solid evidence about what works to improve writing skills,
Mhm.
at least based on the research that's been done in Turkey. Did the researchers have anything to say about future directions or next steps?
Yeah. So in the abstract, they do mention that the full paper discusses future research directions as well as the implications of these findings for practice. So while we don't have all those specifics here in the abstract, it's good to keep in mind that this is part of an ongoing conversation, and research in this area is constantly evolving.
Right. The learning never stops,
Yeah.
which is a good thing. Okay, so for our listeners out there, if we were to really sum up, what's the big takeaway here? What's the core message from this deep dive into writing interventions in Turkey?
I think the big takeaway is that these different interventions, and particularly the ones that really emphasize the importance of planning before you write, having a structured process or step-by-step approach, and directly teaching students specific writing strategies and skills, all of these can have a huge impact on how well students write.
And that effect size, that average effect size of 1.39, that's really saying something.
It really is. It's not just a tiny little blip. These are meaningful changes.
Right. I think it's really encouraging, too. Because sometimes, we might think, oh, I'm just not a good writer.
Hmm.
But this research suggests that writing ability is not just some innate talent that you're born with. With the right instruction, with the right approach, anyone can improve their writing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a question for you, listener, to think about as you go about your day. Given what we've learned from this research in Turkey, what are some things that you might be able to take and apply to your own writing process, or even just your learning process in general, no matter what you're working on? Could you benefit from spending more time planning, thinking in terms of stages and steps, seeking out specific strategies and techniques?
Yeah. This research really points to the power of being intentional and having a structured approach, not just in writing, but in any area of life where you're trying to learn something new or create something new. So I think reflecting on your own process, how you approach these things, can be incredibly valuable.
Couldn't agree more. And with that, we have taken a deep dive into a whole bunch of educational research, hopefully giving you a shortcut to understanding some key insights into how we can all become better writers
And learners.
and learners. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, until next time.
See you.